That winding road above Los Angeles is named after the man who built the second deadliest disaster in the history of California. It's called Mulholland Drive, and almost nobody driving it tonight knows what William Mulholland actually did. In 1928, a dam he built broke in the middle of the night and sent a wall of water 54 miles to the Pacific Ocean. The internet says it killed 450 people. Some say more than 600. We checked, and neither number is right. And what's left of that dam is still sitting in the canyon tonight. We went looking for the machines that built this dam. That's the whole job on this channel. We find the iron still sitting in the famous places, and we check the numbers people repeat about it. St. Francis Dam fought us from the first minute. Because this is what we found. There is no fleet to name here. No Marion shovel with a serial number. No bulldozer anyone can point to. No auction where it all went. The city of Los Angeles built this dam itself, with its own crews, and almost none of the equipment records survived. We went through the engineering reports, the coroner's files, and the Santa Clarita Valley Historical Society archive, and there is no purchase ledger that lists those machines by name. So if you came here for a bulldozer buried in the concrete, we're going to be straight with you. It isn't here. But the story of what built this thing, and what it left behind, is stranger than any buried bulldozer. Go back to the early 1920s. Los Angeles is exploding, and it is bone dry. Mulholland is the man who solved that. He's a self-taught engineer, no college degree, an Irish immigrant who taught himself hydraulics out of borrowed books, and he had already built the Los Angeles Aqueduct, hundreds of miles of it, dragging water across the desert and into the city. At that moment, he was one of the most trusted men in California. But that aqueduct ran for over 200 miles through open, empty country, and Mulholland was worried about it. One bomb on the line, one act of sabotage, and Los Angeles could be cut off from its water for months. So he wanted a giant reservoir close to the city, one that could hold nearly a year's supply, so that if the line ever went down, the taps would keep running. St. Francis Dam was that insurance policy. When he needed it built, nobody second-guessed him. They built St. Francis Dam in San Francisquito Canyon, about 40 miles north of downtown. A curved concrete wall, poured from a mixing plant right at the base of the canyon, fed by cableways strung across the gorge that carried the wet concrete out over the site. A steam shovel cut the footing into the canyon walls. And as the work went on, Mulholland ordered the dam raised. Twice. Another 10 feet, then another 10, until it stood more than 200 feet from the foundation to the crest. Here's the part that matters. When he raised the height, he didn't widen the base to match. He made the wall taller and left the bottom the same. Nobody flagged it. He was Mulholland. And the ground under the eastern end of that dam had a secret in it that no engineer alive in 1926 could have seen. The dam finished filling on March 7, 1928. More than 12 billion gallons of water, the biggest reservoir the city owned outside the Owens Valley, pressing on that concrete wall for the first time. And almost immediately, the dam started to leak. Now every concrete dam leaks a little. Mulholland knew that. The dam keeper knew that. His name was Tony Harnischfeger, and he lived with his family in a cottage a quarter mile below the wall, close enough to hear it. On the morning of March 12, 1928, Harnischfeger found a new leak, and this one was carrying mud. Muddy water coming out of the abutment is the one thing that should stop an engineer's heart. Clear water is just seepage, but muddy water means the leak is carrying the foundation out with it. So Harnischfeger called it in. Mulholland drove out that same morning with his assistant, Harvey Van Norman, and the two of them walked the dam. They looked at the leak, and they decided it was nothing. New cracks, a little muddy water, normal for a fresh dam settling in. Mulholland signed off on it and drove back to the city. That was around noon. He had about 12 hours. Just before midnight, the eastern end of the dam let go. We know the time almost to the minute. Here's why. When the wall failed, it tore out a power line running through the canyon, and the outage froze a clock downstream at 11:57 at night. The first people to die were almost certainly Harnischweger and his family, in the cottage a quarter-mile below. His body was never found. What came down the canyon was a wall of water about 140 feet high. That is taller than a 12-story building, moving. It hit the powerhouse just below the dam, a full crew and their families asleep inside, and erased it. 65 people by one count, more than 100 by another. Either way, almost no one there lived. And this is the detail that tells you how fast it happened. The generators in that powerhouse were bolted to the floor. When investigators came back, the building was gone and the men were gone, but the machines were still there, still bolted down, sitting in the open where the walls used to be. The water went straight through and left the iron standing. That was 5 minutes in. The flood had 54 miles still to run, and thousands of people downstream had no idea it was coming. There were no sirens. There was no phone tree that worked. The water moved down San Francisquito Canyon and into the Santa Clara River Valley in the dark, and most of the people it killed were asleep when it reached them. The first big camp in its path was a construction crew for Southern California Edison, working on a power line near a spot called Kemp. They were in tents on the riverbank. 84 of them died there in a few minutes. Down the valley, the water hit Castaic Junction. Then the farm towns, Piru, Fillmore, Bardsdale, Santa Paula. Whole families in wood frame houses, gone between one breath and the next. And this is where we have to stop and check the number, because this is where the record breaks down. You will read that 450 people died. You will also read more than 600. The honest answer is that no one ever produced a real, final count, and there is a reason for that. This flood tore through migrant labor camps in the middle of the night. Mexican farm workers, fruit pickers, Edison work crews, people who moved with the harvest, rented nothing, and whose whole families sometimes died together, with no one left behind to walk into an office and report them missing. Bodies came out of the ground for months. Some were carried all the way to the ocean and down the coast, a few found as far south as the Mexican border. And this part is almost hard to believe. Victims of this flood were still turning up decades later. Human remains were found near Newhall in the 1970s, and again in the 1990s, more than 60 years after the water came through. You cannot get a clean count of the dead when the water erased entire households nobody was keeping a list of. The best work anyone has done on this came from a graduate researcher named Ann Stansel, who spent years going through the records name by name for a master's thesis at Cal State Northridge, finished in 2014. Stansel documented the victims one at a time, and the count came to 411. 306 bodies recovered, 105 people still missing. The figure most historians use now is at least 431. And Stansel's own point is that even that number is almost certainly too low, because the people this disaster undercounted were exactly the people nobody was counting to begin with. So the real answer to how many died is not 450, and it is not a tidy 600. It is at least 431, and more than anyone will ever prove. The water reached the ocean near Ventura about 5.5 hours after the dam broke. 54 miles. It was, and still is, one of the worst engineering failures in American history. And the man whose name was on it was about to stand up in a hearing room and do something almost nobody in his position does anymore. If you want the checked version of these stories, instead of the myth, subscribe. We pull one of these out of the ground every few days. Now the hearing, because this is the part that still gets Mulholland a strange kind of respect. They convened a coroner's inquest to figure out who was to blame. And Mulholland did not send a lawyer to hide behind. He sat down in front of that jury, and he took it. His words from that room are still quoted. He told them the only ones he envied in the whole thing were the dead. And he told them not to fasten blame on anyone else. That if there was an error of human judgment, he was the human. He didn't spread it across his staff. He didn't blame the weather, or the leak, or the rock. He put it on himself, in public, on the record. The jury cleared him of a crime, but they said something in their findings that outlived the disaster. They said the building of a public dam should never again be left to the judgment of one man, no matter how brilliant, no matter how trusted. That sentence is a big part of why we have Independent Dam Review today, and it was paid for in San Francisquito Canyon. Mulholland was broken by it. He retired within months, mostly disappeared from public life, and died in 1935. Now, for decades, the official story was that the rock on the western side of the canyon failed. That is what the 1928 jury believed. But the real answer took another 60 years, and it came from a geologist named J. David Rogers, who went back through the evidence and found that everyone in 1928 had been staring at the wrong side of the canyon. The dam did not start failing on the west. It started on the east. And the eastern hillside, it turned out, was sitting on top of an ancient landslide, a slab of ground that had slid once already in the deep geological past, and then gone quiet for thousands of years. The rock there was a weak schist that turned slick when it got wet. As the reservoir filled and soaked into that hillside, the old slide woke up. The ground let go. The dam went with it. And that muddy leak harnish fagor found on the last morning was the mountain quietly telling everyone what was about to happen. And we want to be fair about this. The 1920s engineers were not fools, and they were not lying. The flaw that killed those people was buried inside a hillside, invisible, and the science to find it did not exist yet. Mulholland raised the dam and never widened the base, and that was a real mistake. But the thing that actually pulled the trigger was a landslide nobody on Earth could have seen in 1926. That combination is why engineers still study this collapse. There was a real design mistake here, and underneath it, a flaw the science of the day had no way to detect. Which brings us back to the canyon and to the question we started with. If the machines are gone and the dam is gone, what is actually still out there? More than you would think. And one piece of it is still running. Start with the wall itself. When the dam broke, it didn't just crumble. It threw pieces of itself down the canyon, and some of those pieces were the size of houses. Chunks of concrete weighing as much as 10,000 tons were carried hundreds of feet from where they were poured. They are still lying in San Francisquito Canyon right now, scattered across the creek bed, the steel reinforcing bars bent and shorn off where the concrete tore apart. You can walk down and stand next to them. People do. Today, the site is a national memorial. Congress made it one in 2019. But if you drove out there expecting a monument, you would be surprised. There is no grand marker and no visitor center. There is just the broken concrete in the creek bed, a lot of it covered in spray paint. In a canyon the old road no longer even reaches. The disaster the city tried to erase is still out there, half hidden, which is more or less how everyone seems to want to leave it. But the strangest survivor was the center of the dam. When the wall failed, one tall section in the middle stayed standing, just a lone slab of concrete sticking straight up out of the wreckage. People started calling it the tombstone, and it became a tourist attraction. Sightseers drove out to climb it and have their photo taken on top of the dam that had just killed hundreds of people. And then, in 1929, a young man climbing the tombstone slipped and fell to his death. He is sometimes called the disaster's last victim. So the city of Los Angeles made a decision. They were not going to let that slab keep drawing crowds. On May 10th, 1929, city crews packed the tombstone with dynamite, about 5 tons of it, drilled into the base and wired to blow. A city engineer named R.R. Robertson set off the charge, and the last standing piece of St. Francis Dam came down into a pit they had dug for it. The most visible reminder of the disaster was erased on purpose by the same city that built it. And those broken pieces are part of what you can still find in the canyon today. And then there is the machine. Because there is one. Remember, this dam existed to make power as much as to hold water. There were 2 powerhouses. Powerhouse 2, just below the dam, was the one the flood erased in the first 5 minutes. And even there, the machines outlasted the building. When the city rebuilt that plant, they pulled 2 of the old turbines out of the wreckage and put them back to work. But upstream there was another one, Powerhouse 1, that the flood never reached. It had opened in 1917, years before the dam was even finished. And it is still there, not as a ruin, as a working power plant. The water agency that runs it will tell you that 2 of the original turbines inside Powerhouse 1 are still turning today. One of them was installed in 1917. The other went in around 1923. They have been generating electricity through the disaster and every decade since for roughly 100 years. That is the closest thing this story has to a machine that outlived everything. The iron we came looking for. It is the same water system Mulholland built, and one of his powerhouses never stopped running. That road on the ridgeline was laid out in 1922 and opened to cars in 1924, back when Mulholland was still a hero and the dam was still standing. So the next time you are up on Mulholland Drive, watching the lights of the city come on below you, remember whose name is on that road. He built the water that made the city possible. He built the dam that killed at least 431 people in a single night, and probably far more than anyone ever counted. The dam is gone. The tombstone was dynamited, but the man's turbines are still spinning in a canyon most people will never visit. We have got more of these buried on the screen. We will see you in the next one.